Okay, let's move into part two of our discussion of motivation. I do want you to be very comfortable discussing these different theories of motivation as you work on your homework problems. First off, for this part of the review, let's talk about Herzberg's motivation hygiene theory. The idea here, and again this one is well known, is that what Herzberg did was divide attributes of a job into those attributes that serve to motivate employees versus those that are just sort of necessary in order to have them be somewhat satisfied with their job. So it's things that motivate and things that satisfy. And what he found is that there are a lot of things that can result in dissatisfaction. Some of these hygiene factors can lead to dissatisfaction if they're not fulfilled. And so let's just look at his list here and talk about it, and you can see why it would be. It's really very logical at one level. Now, keep in mind, this is another point though. Herzberg's research was conducted with people in professional occupations, primarily engineers. So I do think that is some of these generalizations about these motivational factors and hygiene factors can be restricted to that population. We don't want to generalize his research results beyond that. So he identified hygiene factors and motivators. And let's talk about what these mean. So see this list on the left: a salary, what wages you make, the job security associated with your job, the working conditions themselves, the status associated with that job, the company policies that are in place, whether they make sense or not, the quality of the technical supervision that's there, the quality of coworker relationships, and the relationship with the supervisor are all what he found to be hygiene factors. Now, what that means is more of it does not motivate, but to the degree they are limited or there are problems with any of them, then the employee will be dissatisfied. So you realize salary is the top of that list. But what Herzberg found is that salary does not motivate people to work. Salary is sort of an expectation. They expect that salary. And if the salary is not what they think it should be, then they are dissatisfied. Once it's corrected, and they now are making what they think is fair, or maybe what a colleague is making, whatever the basis was for them deciding they were dissatisfied with it, then they are now satisfied. But that does not mean they're motivated to work harder. Okay, that according to Herzberg's theory, salary doesn't motivate most people. It just causes them to either be satisfied or dissatisfied. It can work against motivation. It generally does not work for motivation. The same for job security. If someone is concerned about their job security, they're going to be dissatisfied and it'll work against motivation. But if they feel secure in their job, then they're satisfied, but there's nothing about job security that will make them work harder and do more. And the same for the rest of the list. So you can see how all of those line up. And in essence, it has led many people to understand that, particularly in professional occupations where salaries seem to be really high, and you think, good grief, for that amount of money, can't they at least, work hard for it? Well, the reality is it's not a motivating factor. It is part of what could dissatisfy them if they see anything unfair about it, but it will not motivate them. On the right-hand side, though, we see what are the motivational factors in Herzberg's theory. And that's things like achievement, being able to accomplish things, that feeling of satisfaction, that people will work hard because they are achievement-oriented and they are seeing results from that. They are motivated by recognition, by more responsibility, by opportunities for advancement, by the work itself as a form of intrinsic reward, and for opportunities for personal growth. So if you look at these achievement, recognition, responsibility, what does that say to you? If we were to contrast that back to Maslow's theory, in essence what we're saying is, these motivators to work hard and go above and beyond are attached to those higher order factors in the Maslow model, whereas the hygiene factors are the ones that were related to, safety, security, stability, and that kind of thing for the most part. So it's interesting to think about how those two models in some ways reflect each other. And it's quite interesting to think about what that means for work. So it doesn't matter if you continue to give money to people if they don't. I mean, it's not going to motivate them to do more unless there is a perception of unfairness. If there's a perception of unfairness, or if they feel like they're, say, not at market salary or something like that, and they have some concern about it, it can lead to dissatisfaction. But even if you correct that situation, it will just stabilize things. It will not lead to a higher level of motivation with that individual. Now, let's reference back to McClelland's work. We talked about this before when we talked about personality. But McClelland's theory, again, if you recall, is this need for achievement, need for affiliation, need for power. And within the context of this discussion of motivation, you might imagine that the point here is to say that if people have these needs, and to the degree those needs can be fulfilled at work, then it can be a motivating work environment for them. So he talks about the need for achievement and the strong desire to perform challenging tasks well and meet personal standards of excellence, like we talked about. They tend to have a tendency to take calculated risks. They like to assume responsibility for solving problems. They tend to set challenging goals, and they want feedback on their performance. So somebody who is achievement-oriented wants to set goals that indicate that something is being achieved, and they want feedback saying that they have achieved it. So that's common sense if you think about it. And that kind of individual, it's clear that recognitions, rewards, feedback are what they want in order to stay motivated about their achievements. They want to be able to achieve what they set out to accomplish. Now, something that would completely undermine and demoralize somebody with a high need for achievement is if they didn't have the flexibility to take the action they needed to, maybe not the autonomy to take the action they needed to, maybe they don't have the budget to do the work that they need to, they don't have the time to do it well. If those kinds of constraints enter into the work environment of somebody with a high need for achievement, it can block them from accomplishing what they want to accomplish, and that can be very demoralizing and reduce motivation. Now, remember the other two needs were need for affiliation and need for power. Well, if you think about someone who has a high need for affiliation, if they're in an environment at work where they are constantly put in situations where there's conflict, where there's sort of a culture of challenge and conflict, which we would have argued from our decision-making discussion could well be the right way to go, right? But sometimes that really undermines the feeling of security and social interaction that they're looking for in their job, and that can actually be demotivating. All of this comes down to understanding people, sort of where they're coming from, and making sure you're putting them in the right work environment and the right kind of job, and giving them the resources to accomplish their job too. The need for power, again, was the extent to which individuals wanted to influence others. Well, that kind of individual wants to be in a situation where there are decisions to be made, and they want to be part of the decision. They want to be part of making the case for the decisions that are made. And so to the degree that they're not given some sort of authority and autonomy to help make decisions about where things are going and help create momentum in that direction, they can just be, frustrated and bored in their job. So again, think of these needs and how a manager has an opportunity to create an environment to allow an employee, help an employee be successful so that those needs are satisfied. That'll maintain a much higher level of motivation and performance with those employees. Equity theory is another one of these motivation theories. Equity theory talks about people's perceptions of fairness or lack of fairness and how their work outcomes are compared to how much time and effort they put into it. So equity theory is sort of looking at this ratio of inputs to outputs, how much I put in given what my rewards, say, are for that. It introduces the idea of equity, which is justice, impartiality, and fairness, to which all organization members are entitled. So equity is just fairness on the job, impartiality, meaning nobody has favoritism shown to them. You know, we don't have one person working really, really hard and getting nothing out of it and somebody else slacking and free riding and getting all of the rewards. And of course, it's up to management to ensure that that doesn't happen. Inequity, of course, is the lack of fairness. It's the opposite of equity. Let's look at this chart from your book to elaborate a little bit more on the idea of equity theory. So if we're looking at this ratio of how hard I'm working to, and my contributions in terms of time and effort, and then what I get from that, maybe what we're talking about, at least in this example, is a higher salary and more opportunity for promotion. So there's a person and there's a referent. So in this example, it says an engineer perceives that he contributes more inputs and receives proportionally more outcomes than his referent. So when comparing himself to someone else, or whatever in his mind is the basis for reference, he believes, in this case, I'm putting in a lot of time and effort, but I'm getting a lot of benefit from that. I am being paid for my performance, and I'm being given opportunities because of my performance. In that situation, because the person is seeing themselves as contributing more and getting more, then that's equity. That's an equity state. Okay? The underpayment inequity, which can exist, is when an engineer, for example, perceives that he contributes more inputs but receives the same outcomes as his referent. This happens all the time, particularly in an environment when a manager's lazy and gives everybody the same raise, irrespective of how hard they've worked and what they've accomplished. It's not just how hard you work, right? It's what you accomplish. So they believe that they are working harder and doing more, but they're being paid the same as everybody else. So that's underpayment inequity, and it can be demoralizing. Now, again, as we always talk about in this class, what are the facts here? What are the facts? Are they, just putting in more time and effort but not accomplishing anymore? Just because they're inefficient in their work does not mean they get more money for it, right? It's just a question of, if they are getting more done, getting more high quality work done, but they are not being recognized for that, then you have underpayment inequity. Overpayment inequity is really the opposite of that. And in this example, it says an engineer perceives that he contributes the same inputs as everybody else, but receives more outcomes than his referent. So he sees himself as benefiting compared to his reference. That's considered an overpayment inequity. So what does all this then mean? When you have equity, then everything's good. You're going to have a motivated employee. If you have underpayment inequity, meaning they don't believe they're being paid what they should, then there's a problem. They believe their own output-input ratio is less than the ratio of a referent. And then overpayment inequity, their own output-input ratio is greater than the ratio of a referent. What happens? If they are under-rewarded, then what they'll tend to do, they'll be demotivated, right? They'll decrease their effort. They'll attempt to increase their outcomes. They may lobby for a raise. They may complain about inequity. It could be that they will begin to distort what's going on. They'll begin to distort how much they're working and how much they're putting into it, and it'll all be sort of in their own mind that they're working that hard. They could choose to quit or transfer or just start having some behavioral problems, be absent. And it could be that they would ignore the situation. That's always an alternative too. But if you have something that is truly unfair in that situation, you're going to have a dismotivated, unmotivated employee, demotivated, there's the word, demotivated employee until you get it straightened out. And as we talked about, this aligns with Herzberg's hygiene theory, right? In that it's not that they're going to work all that much harder if their salary is straightened out. It is that they will be demotivated until they get it straightened out. Okay, over reward, according to this theory, they will increase their effort, and everybody's going to be happy in the end. I'm not sure you see that much, to be honest with you. I think if they're over rewarded, they'll just rationalize in their mind that they deserved it, and it won't be, because they won't feel an obligation to increase their effort to align the ratio of outcomes to inputs. You have to have been in management for a while to sort of see that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the idea of justice in organizations. Again, this is just some terms and concepts that you need to know. Distributive justice is a person's perception of the fairness of the distribution of outcomes in an organization. So that's just how fair is this place in terms of how rewards are distributed. Procedural justice refers to a person's perception of the fairness of the procedures that are used to determine how to distribute outcomes in an organization. So just procedural justice means they understand and agree with the method that is used to provide raises, or distribute outcomes means distribute rewards to people within the organization. So some people, again, when you have, say, 10 people in your department and the department's doing well, they get a certain amount of money to distribute as raises, they may just divide by the number of people in the department and give everybody the same amount of money. It could be they'll take a percentage. If they're given a percentage of the salary pool, they'll give everybody the same percentage increase, which for those who make a lot of money is a whole lot more dollars than the ones that don't make much money. So you could either divide it up by dollars, you could divide it up by percentages, or you could actually evaluate their performance, decide who did a really, really good job, give them more than you give to the people whose performance is not quite as high. So, all three of those examples are example of procedures that could be used, and how people perceive the fairness of those will, be sort of a function of whether they agree with it, whether they benefit from it. There's also interpersonal justice, a person's perception of the fairness of the interpersonal treatment he or she receives from whoever distributes outcomes to him or her. So that's just, do they trust the individuals? And then there's informational justice, a person's perception of the extent to which his or her manager provides explanations for decisions and the procedures used to arrive at them. And so what does all of this say? This all says that justice and perceptions of justice, because it's really about perceptions, matter in an organization. And how would you improve this perception of justice in your organization? Well, one is to be very open about what these processes and procedures are, and to be clear about why rewards or outcomes are distributed in the fashion that they are. Now, in most private companies, that kind of information can be very confidential. So raises aren't communicated, and performance rankings are not communicated, and that kind of thing. But in some organizations, particularly government organizations, all that information is public. And so the question is, what can you do if you have a morale issue to sort of appease the concerns, the perceptions of unfairness, of a lack of justice here? Well, it's revealing your processes or procedures. It's, communicating the information about it that was used. What information was used to make decisions. Okay, that concludes our discussion of motivation. There's some additional content in your chapter about pay for performance and methods to align pay with performance, and you can follow all of those. I viewed those as a little off topic for motivation and more in line with the human resource management chapter, and there's some other topics that are covered in that chapter when we get to it. But this is a conclusion to what are the key motivation theories And I hope that in your work through your assignments for this week that you'll be able to compare and contrast those theories and then use the theories in redesigning a work situation. Okay, great. See you next week.